Stated Clearly presents Evidence for Evolution in Your Own DNA, Endogenous Retroviruses. You've probably heard that great apes like chimpanzees are humankind's closest living relatives. Even before evolution was discovered, scientists studying comparative anatomy already grouped humans into the ape family alongside chimpanzees. In those pre-evolution years, however, the word family was often used figuratively. Many scientists held a fixed species view. They thought humans and chimpanzees had been similar yet different since the dawn of time. This changed by the end of the 1800s. Along with the discovery of the process of evolution, the study of fossils convinced the majority of scientists that humans and chimps do share a common ancestor. We really are family. Today, hundreds of transitional fossils have been found, representing over 20 distinct groups which blur the line between humans and chimpanzees. That said, some people feel that the study of fossils is too subjective. Is there an independent line of evidence we can use to double-check what we think we know from the study of fossils and anatomy? Dr. Francis Collins, the man who directed the Human Genome Project, rightfully pointed out that the study of DNA gives us an entirely independent, quantifiable way to test our ideas about evolution. Instead of simply taking his word for it, here we will examine the evidence for ourselves. It's widely known that DNA is great at revealing family relationships. In the court of law, DNA evidence is the gold standard for determining who the father is. DNA evidence is now widely used in the study of genealogy to figure out more distant family relationships. And there are many independent ways that DNA evidence can be used to reveal family relationships even between different species. Here, we'll zoom in on just one line of DNA evidence: endogenous retrovirus DNA shared across species. In this case, between humans and chimpanzees. To understand why retrovirus DNA is such a big deal, let's first take a quick look at what retroviruses are. A retrovirus is a special type of virus that reproduces by inserting its genes directly into a cell's DNA. The virus genes become a seamless, permanent part of the host cell's genome. The cell treats the virus DNA as if it were its own. It reads the virus genes, using them to make new viruses, and when the cell copies its own DNA before reproducing, it also copies the virus DNA and passes it on as well. In mammals, modern retroviruses usually infect white blood cells. If, however, a retrovirus happens to infect a sperm cell or egg cell, and if that sperm or egg cell ends up participating in fertilization, the resulting child will have a copy of virus DNA in every single one of her cells. She'll even pass it on to her kids if she has children. Now, you might think that this is a guaranteed death sentence for the child, but the immune system can sometimes handle the problem. Normal copying errors in virus DNA can also shut a virus down. In these cases, a retrovirus insertion can be thought of as a single, giant mutation for the host. As is the case with all mutations, a retrovirus insertion might have a negative effect on the individual that contains it. It might be neutral, or, with a bit of luck, it could end up being beneficial. Virus genes also act as extra genetic material that evolution can, quote, play with as generations pass on. Future mutations can give virus genes new functions, some of which might happen to be useful. Recent studies have found that, in at least one case, it seems that an ancient mammal was infected with a virus that ended up aiding the animal in reproduction. Many of that early mammal's descendants, humans included, eventually became fully dependent on the virus gene. We can no longer reproduce without it. We are part virus. When a retrovirus becomes a permanent part of a species' DNA, whether or not it's functional, scientists call it an endogenous retrovirus. Endogenous because it is inside us from birth. It turns out that the human genome contains thousands of endogenous retrovirus segments, long stretches of DNA with sequences that match those of retroviruses. Luckily for us, none of ours can still make full-fledged viruses. They have simply mutated too much to perform their original virusy functions. Okay, so if all of this is news to you, it's probably a lot to take in, so let's recap super quick before we look at how endogenous retroviruses act as evidence for evolution. An endogenous retrovirus is a stretch of DNA found in your DNA that got there when one of your ancestors was infected by a retrovirus. on rare occasions, virus genes find their way into sperm and egg cells where they can go on to become a permanent part of a species' genome. Your endogenous retroviruses act as historical records of past infections suffered by your ancestors. Now, at this point, you might be asking, how do we know for sure that genes with similar sequences to virus genes actually came from viruses? Has this been experimentally demonstrated? In several different cases, yes. Scientists recently took human cells incubated in petri dishes and slightly mutated the DNA of one of our endogenous retroviruses to see if it would start producing viruses again. Sure enough, it worked. An extinct virus was revived from a DNA sequence found in our very own human genome. Endogenous retroviruses really are the remaining scars of ancient virus infections. So, how does this all act as evidence that humans, chimps, and other primates really evolved from a common ancestor? In 2003, the first draft of the chimp genome was published. Overall, chimp DNA and human DNA sequences are incredibly similar, but unless we dive deeper, this fact alone can't tell us for sure if evolution is a better explanation than the fixed species idea. We already know that humans and chimps have similar traits. If DNA codes for traits, we should expect our DNA to be similar as well, right? In many cases, this is a reasonable point, but not in the case of endogenous retroviruses. Remember, your endogenous retroviruses show you the unique history of specific virus infections suffered by your ancestors. They're like scars in our DNA that an individual acquires during its lifetime and can pass on to his or her descendants, but only his or her descendants. Here we're looking at maps of human and chimp chromosomes side by side. Chromosomes are the structures in our cells that contain our DNA. If humans and chimps share a common ancestor, and if at least some of the infections we find in our genome occurred before the chimp-human split, we should find the same virus genes in the exact same locations in both human and chimp genomes. In contrast, if humans and chimps are not related, they should not share the same history of virus infections. Now, of course, it is possible that throughout history, both species, humans and chimps, were infected by some of the same viruses. Humans and chimps sometimes get each other sick today. But if chimps and humans are not related, those virus genes will not be found in identical locations of both chimp and human DNA. This is because when a retrovirus infects a host, there are many different spots in the host genome where it might end up inserting itself. Extensive lab experiments with retroviruses have found that there are far more than 10 million possible insertion spots in the human genome. In other words, the chance of a human and a chimp getting infected in the exact same spot by the same specific type of virus is far less than 1 in 10 million.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Well, it's ridiculously unlikely and it gets worse fast. If two individuals are both infected with just 12 of the same viruses, the chance that each of those 12 inserted themselves into the exact same DNA locations in both hosts is less than 1 in the number of all the atoms estimated to exist in the entire observable universe. To get a rough idea of how many insertions are shared between humans and chimps, researchers scanned both of our genomes looking for a type of retrovirus they knew was common in humans. They found 211 insertions in the human genome and 208 in chimpanzees. To figure out if any of these insertions are in the same locations in both humans and chimps, they compared the unique flanking DNA sequences on either side of each insertion. If you think of the virus as a scar, the flanking sequences are the healthy bits of tissue around the scar that tell you where the scar is located. They found that we share not just 1, not just 12, but 205 insertions. 205 out of 214 for this particular virus group. This makes perfect sense if we consider the evolutionary view of life. The 205 shared viruses were inserted sometime before the chimp-human split. The 6 insertions unique to humans and the 3 unique to chimps either represent insertions that happened after the split, or they represent deletion mutations that removed a few viruses in just one lineage after the chimp-human split. In contrast, if we want to believe the fixed species view, we're forced to conclude that these viruses are simply shared by coincidence. When we do the math, even Making sure to account for the 9 viruses not shared by the 2 species, the chance of this happening by coincidence is less than 1 in this crazy number right here. This evidence should be enough for even the most reluctant yet rational person to carefully set aside the fixed species view. Endogenous retrovirus DNA alone is more than enough to independently confirm what we already knew from the study of fossils. That said, what we've seen here is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other lines of DNA evidence available. Together they demonstrate beyond all reasonable doubt that humans and chimpanzees did evolve from a common ancestor. We are family.
We are part of this very complicated, amazing evolutionary history. We are related to those other animals, especially animals like non-human primates like the chimpanzees. We are directly descended from a common ancestor. The evidence for that is overwhelming. That evolutionary mechanism by which life has spread across this planet and all of its amazing diversity over something like 4 billion years is about as well established as anything I know in science. So if somebody wants to tell you, well, evolution's just a theory and it'll probably go away someday, it's about as likely to go away as gravity is. It is extremely well supported, and particularly so by the study of DNA.
This animation was funded by Colt Correa and by our supporters at patreon.com.